Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for being here today. My name is Ana Dorrego-Rivas. I'm a postdoc at King's College London and also a member of the Credibility Advisory Board at the BNA. Today's webinar is part of the BNA's work to strengthen credibility in neuroscience, and it's supported by the Gatsby Foundation. So some details before we start with the first speaker. Today, each speaker will have 10 to 12 minutes to talk. And if there is any question in the audience, please type it on the Q&A tab. The chat will be used for general points. This webinar will be recorded and will be available from the BNA Credibility in Neuroscience site, which hopefully you can see the link in the chat soon. And so our first speaker is Emily Farran, who is a professor of developmental psychology and academic lead research culture and integrity at the University of Surrey. So the floor is yours, Emily. We're ready when you are.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Right, and I'll just move all your faces out of the way. Okay, so thank you for inviting me today. So I'm going to be talking to you about our open research journey, as it were, that we've been having at the University of Surrey and that we're still continuing with. So before I do, I'm sure most of the people who have come to this webinar understand what open research is and understand the benefits of open research, but I do find it quite useful to think about it in terms of a case study. In the COVID-19 pandemic, one kind of silver lining of the pandemic is that it's a really good case study of the importance of transparency and the importance of open research. So on this slide, you can see a couple of quotes. The first one from the State of Open Data report, which talks about the pandemic and how it brought about this overwhelming kind of need for people to collaborate. So because we needed answers quite quickly and we needed to get this kind of global understanding, there was a lot of collaboration happening in the COVID-19 pandemic. And in order to do that, there was a lot of open science, so that there was data sharing and code sharing and method sharing happening across the globe. And so particularly at the very beginning of the pandemic, preprints were really, really critical because we needed answers very quickly. So they were critical in providing the latest research kind of popped off the press as it was written up. As I've said already, global collaboration increased, and the use of this open data and this collaboration accelerated many, many things that we needed to discover about the virus in terms of spread, infection patterns, etc. And if we take this a little bit further, this is data that Anna from UNESCO presented last year. And at that point, she was looking at the percentage of papers in different fields that were open access. And so 30% of scientific publications generally are open access, and climate change, which is a good comparison of a very sort of important topic that people, lots of people need to know about and the public are aware of, etc. 50% are open access. But when you compare this to COVID-19, 85% are open access. And so this demonstrates the kind of importance that was put on the research that was coming out of COVID-19. And I'll just quickly flick back to the comment from Brian Nosek here, which is, imagine if we considered all research to be important enough to conduct it as openly and collaboratively as this. And so just moving on, when we think about published research, it has a number of different functions. So it increases our knowledge, it motivates future research, it inspires new products, it can inform government policy and many, many more things. But we need to be confident in the findings of this published research. And this is where open research comes in. So the findings need to be reproducible. And one way of making sure that findings are reproducible is to make every aspect of the research cycle transparent. So what do we mean by open research? Again, this audience, you probably have a very good idea of what we mean by open research, but it's quite useful to put some of these definitions up. So you can see kind of how it connects to our current research culture. So the first one talks about it being a collection of actions that make scientific processes more transparent, results more accessible. So this is where we can get this sort of public trust in our research. And this sort of word of replication, reproducibility, robustness, this all relates to the reproducibility crisis, which is a whole other talk. But by kind of demonstrating your science in a kind of recipe book way, then someone else can follow the exact same steps and reproduce or replicate your findings, which enables us to determine how rigorous that science is, how robust it is. And then this other quote from the State of Open Data talks about this paradigm shift which is needed. So there's a lot of discussion at the moment about research culture, because we're trying to move away from this sort of publish or perish research culture, where it's all about how many papers you've got, how many citations you've got, how much funding you're bringing in. And it talks about this in this definition here. And it says open science, on the other hand, is about encouraging researchers to collaborate, to share with each other and the public, and to be transparent for the greater good of research and society. And just adding to this as well, in terms of our funded research, by being open, then we're kind of getting more out of that money. So people are able to use our data, they're able to reuse things that we've produced, so that we're from a sort of economic point of view, it makes sense. So I've listed below at the bottom here a kind of different kinds of open research practices that we could consider. So we have these definitions of open research, but there's a systematic change happening. So I talked about the publish or perish culture that we're trying to move away from, and looking at these quotes from UNESCO, from the UK to Government R&D roadmap, which are both relatively recent, and also from our own PVC Research and Innovation at the University of Surrey, you can see that there's definitely a move towards just taking one of the quotes, embracing the potential of open research practices. So thinking about the whole research cycle, recognizing outputs from across the research cycle, and using this to make sure that we can understand the science, and we can ensure that it's reproducible, it is of high quality, it's rigorous, for example. And even this year, UKRI brought in an additional mandate that for journal articles, we now all have to put a data availability statement on our journal outputs. And so this is another way in which we're sort of moving towards this new movement of sharing all aspects of the research. So just to quote the last one, openness is at the heart of a strong scholarly research culture as a mechanism to increase reproducibility, to lower barriers to accessing knowledge, and to build upon each other's work. And then from the point of view of researchers, there are lots of different incentives to practice open research. But I've kind of cautiously put let me just get the laser point. Cautiously put this image up here, because the person practicing open research might be this one in orange. So open research has all of these benefits, but it can take longer. It's not fast science, and fast science is where we risk kind of there's a lot of risk in terms of rigor and errors creeping in, whereas being transparent and practicing more slow science is where we can be much more confident in the rigor. Obviously, being transparent doesn't mean that it's rigorous, but it sort of moves people towards checking every detail and making sure that their results will be reproducible. So just reading through these, as a researcher, if you practice open research, your findings will be reproducible so long as it's been rigorously conducted. You'll have increased citations, increased impact and visibility of your research. There'll be public benefit from that accessibility and their sort of confidence in your research. Increasing the ability of anyone who's reading your research to understand it. You might have opportunities for collaboration. You can get a DOI, a digital object identifier, for any of these outputs that you publish from your research. So for data, for your materials, for protocols, etc. Transparency and reuse. And also, if none of these convince you, then just think of yourself in 5 years' time. If you've written a really, really clear recipe book of what you did, if you want to then replicate that study, or if somebody wants to borrow your material, then there'll be a really robust sort of protocol for people to follow, and you will understand exactly what you did, why you did it, and why, or how you did it and why. So at the University of Surrey, we've been working on all of these principles to think through how we can help our community to understand and to use open research practices. So the University of Surrey was one of the first institutions to join the UK Reproducibility Network. So that's a set of institutions whose common goal is to kind of harmonise this move away from the publish or perish research culture towards a more open and transparent research culture. We established an open research working group, which is comprises of academic members of staff and professional services members of staff. We have an open research action plan, a handbook. We have a series of, I think we now have 26. We launched another one this week on authorship, but 26 open research web pages, which are openly available to anybody, which go through lots of different practices. We have position statements, procedures. We socialise open research, not just in the disciplines where open research is very easy to think about, but in other disciplines as well. And I'll talk to you a bit more about that in a moment. And we have a number of different sort of other things where we socialise open research, such as a Teams community. We have annual lectures. We've created a module, and when people do the module, they get this badge that you can see on the side here. And the badge has metadata in it, so that people can see what the module was about, when you got it, and you can link it to your ORCID profile as well. We have awards, case studies, and a YouTube channel. So we record all of our events and put them on the YouTube channel. So all of these are hyperlinked, and I've shared this with the BNA so that you can access them once they've been put up. So I'm going to just talk you through 3 of our initiatives quickly. Anna, how much time do I have left?
You still have a couple of minutes. You can keep going. Yeah.
So I'll just talk you through 3 of our initiatives. So when I first started in this role at the end of 2019, the first thing I did was wanted to establish baseline data at the University of Surrey to understand people's awareness and experience of open research, what they perceived as barriers or incentives for using open research practices, and what their kind of training needs were. So we put together a questionnaire, and we're about to rerun the questionnaire at the beginning of 2023, so we can see how much our work has kind of changed this profile. But just to show you what we did find, and our findings kind of dictated what our actions were, which went into the action plan. So across a number of different open research practices, which you can see at the bottom here, we asked people about their awareness and whether they were practicing these. And one of the main findings was that people had quite a strong level of awareness, but their practicing was lower. Now, that's understandable, but one of our kind of objectives was to decrease this gap between awareness and practice for different types of open research practices. We then looked at what people perceived as an incentive, and what I've plotted here is this is a function of career level, because one of our findings was that people, of the 9 incentives that we listed, and these are the ones that you saw on the previous slide, for a lot of them, so 4 of them, people perceive them as incentives. Over 50% of people perceive them as incentives. But when you look at different career levels, you can see that the further you are in your career, the less likely you are to perceive it as an incentive. And so this gave us kind of target groups to think about in terms of trying to increase people's awareness of these incentives and the benefits of open research. We asked about barriers, and the main things that came up were lack of training, lack of funding, and lack of time. And I think the time is very much linked to the incentives, because if you're not prioritizing it, then you won't have the time to do it, because you're prioritizing things that you think are more important. And the incentive then perhaps needs to come from the top as well as from the bottom up. And then in terms of training, we found that people had a strong desire for more training, and hence that's why we created all of our web pages, and we created our module. And we do a number of face-to-face training sessions as well. So one of the things I'm quite passionate about is when I first started this role, I went around all of the different schools and realized how much there is that I can learn about what open research means for different disciplines. And so I set about essentially doing a lot of Googling and a lot of asking people on Twitter. And we've put together this resource, which has open research resources for every single discipline. And if you find there's any disciplines missing, then please do get in touch and we can add things. And in each of these resources, so for each of these disciplines, there's an open research case study, and then there's a table of resources according to these different categories. And we review this annually, and there's a form so that people can input to it if they want to. And the UKRN just last month have moved it from a PDF document onto a series of web pages. So now you can go on the UKRN web pages and click on your discipline, and it will have all the case studies and resources. And I used this when I went around the schools as well. So when I went around each school, it meant that I could go back to my document and create a bespoke slide for that school so that I could help them to understand what open research means for their discipline, and also get a bit of bi-directional conversation. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'll finish, I think this is my last slide, is developing an open research community. So I did this by visiting all of the departments and schools at Surrey. We also have a Surrey Reproducibility Society, which is led by PGRs and ECRs, which has a regular kind of timetable of events. Just on Tuesday, we launched our Open Research Champion Scheme. So that's where we have a champion within each school who will help with both dissemination of information, but also will feed back to us any training needs that for their particular school, so we can tap into every discipline. And then we have open research lectures, and on the back of those, we also have open research awards, case studies, and our YouTube channel. And then, as I've mentioned already, we have on Teams, we have an open research community. And I'm just going to take an opportunity for a shameless plug. So we're running our next annual event on the 2nd of February. You're all welcome to come. It's hybrid, so you can come in person or join us online. I put a QR code there, but also the information will be on the document as well when it gets uploaded. And I think, oh no, one last slide from me. So you know, hopefully this has all helped in understanding our research culture at the University of Surrey, but it's about the individual researcher as well. So you know, we have to have this knowledge that it does take more time, it does take more resources, but we need stronger recognition at all levels for the importance of this slightly slower research. And this is happening at a funder level, publishers, and at researchers. But it just a plea to you that, you know, if you can participate and train in open research, you're going to be helping to move this research culture forward. And that's the last one. So thank you from me.
Thanks so much, Emily. That was an amazing talk. And it's really great to see how universities are engaging into open science practices. It's really nice. For the attendees, please, if you have any question for Emily, please write it on the Q&A. I have one question, and maybe there's only time for this one. Do you think there has been some sort of increase in open science practices after the COVID pandemic? Do you think it has been a trigger to do these practices?
Well, I don't have any evidence, but I would say, I mean, certainly people, just terminology, people have a better understanding of what some of these things mean. And so when I do talk to people, you know, they know what a preprint is, they know what we mean by open data. And I do think as well that it's given people a hook of understanding, so they can see that here's a case study that everybody knows what it is. And so that they get it. But yeah, in terms of evidence for an increase, I mean, I can see a research project there. Yeah, I don't know.
All right. Thanks so much, Emily. I think we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Rosa Sancho. Rosa is head of Alzheimer's Research UK, and the floor is yours, Rosa.
Thank you, Anna. Can you see my slides correctly?
Yes.
Just minimize you. Okay. So thank you everyone for being here. Like Ana said, I'm Rosa. I'm head of research at a charity called Alzheimer's Research UK, and I'm here to give you the funder's perspective on research culture and why it's important for us. So just to start, a little bit of an introduction on our charity. Our mission is a world free from the fear, harm, and heartbreak of dementia. As I'm sure you're aware, dementia is one of the biggest challenges of our society, and a lot of us at Alzheimer's Research UK have personal experience of it, and I'm sure lots of you in the audience have as well. It's a really important mission for us. And we achieve our mission by funding and supporting research primarily, but also by influencing government and policymakers, and by raising awareness and campaigning for change across society. And across all of these activities, we have three main goals: to diagnose and detect the diseases that cause dementia earlier, to find treatments that change the course of the diseases, and also to reduce risk of dementia. And all of this is underpinned by research that furthers our understanding of the diseases that cause dementia. We recently launched a new research strategy, which talks more about these scientific goals. But what really underpins our science is the researchers that we're funding and the research community that we're funding. And it's in that context that research culture is really important to us. We will not achieve our scientific goals without a really strong research community behind it. And so in our research strategy, we highlight a number of themes that we will be developing and that will cut across all of our research program. And we believe all of these themes play into a better research culture. The first is equity, diversity, and inclusion. So as well as increasing diversity in actual research studies, we will be working towards increasing diversity also across our workforce, because we believe it leads to better and more relevant research with greater longer-term impact. We will be improving our patient and public involvement, listening to our community of people affected by dementia, and ensuring that the research we fund is relevant to them. We will continue to provide time, space, and resources for our research community to network and collaborate meaningfully. We will ensure that our funded researchers take into consideration a clear pathway to impact, and we will be defining and developing a program to address issues with reproducibility in research. And we will continue to develop new partnerships that help us achieve our strategic objectives and encourage our researchers to do so as well. So what we've started doing is piloting some initiatives in these themes, and I can take you through those. Obviously, as a funder, what we have to do is ensure that we improve how we fund research and the process we follow, so that it's unbiased and inclusive. And we are doing so across the different stages, from the applications we receive to reviewing the applications, monitoring and evaluating the research that we fund, and supporting researchers as well. I have to acknowledge here Molly Massetti and Jorge Gomez Magenti, who have really brought a lot of this thinking into AR UK, and they're the ones implementing all of these initiatives. So when it comes to applications, we are piloting the use of narrative CVs. As Emily alluded to, the CVs that are traditionally used in academia include publication lists, grant income lists, and very often they mention journal impact factors. We know that these are currently indicators of prestige, but they do add a lot of bias to the review process. And so instead, we have introduced a narrative CV, which allows applicants to describe their contributions to research in a much broader way, that takes the focus out of metrics, out of publications and grant income, and actually gives more space to other types of contributions to research that should be as valued. And we hope that that way we contribute to a better culture, but also increase the diversity of career pathways and people that get involved in research. We are also considering implementing a self-assessment tool at the application stage where researchers are given an idea of what our expectations are for reproducibility, quality, and transparency. So we will be asking questions like about data management, about how the how research is designed in that lab, how experiments are recorded, or how the training of is undertook in that specific lab. And we hope that this sets the expectation for not just that particular piece of research, but any other research that's going on in that group. When it comes to reviewing applications, we have signed up to DORA principles, and we are making our reviewers aware of those while they're reviewing our applications. And we also now piloting double blinding applications to reviewers in one specific grant call. This is because we've recently undertook a gender analysis of our funding, and we saw very clear disparities in how we were awarding grants at a more senior level to men and women. And so we thought that double blinding applications is a step towards creating a more unbiased review process when it comes to gender. And we're also, together with our friends at the BNA, considering implementing registered reports alongside the review of our applications, which is something that CR UK have already done. And we're really keen to experiment with that as well. When it comes to monitoring and evaluating the research that we're funding, we have moved away from ResearchFish, which, if you are not aware of it, is a tool used by most funders in the UK to assess how research is progressing throughout the lifetime of a grant. We thought it was too metric based, and so we have moved towards a progress report that is much more narrative and qualitative in style. And again, we're just trying to take the focus away from metrics and focusing on what's really important to us, which is how that research is generating knowledge, how we're building a community of researchers, and how that researchers' personal and career development is being benefited by the research. And finally, in supporting researchers, we've recently set up a mentoring scheme for early career researchers, which we're going to be evaluating in the new year. And we've also supported a couple of our senior research fellows to go on leadership and management training, which we hope to continue in the next few years. But we're also encouraging anyone that applies to AR UK grants to include that type of training and any other type of training on more softer skills, not specifically scientific skills, to be included in their budgets, so that if they receive a grant from us, they do have the funding to undertake that sort of training. I thought I would also mention two other things that we're doing that play into reproducibility. We are partners in the Health Open Research platform, which is backed by F1000 and many other research funders. And it's an avenue where researchers can publish openly and in theory quickly as well. And we are funding a project in Edinburgh led by the Camarades group, which is called AD Souls, and it's a systematic online living evidence summary of Alzheimer's disease research. And we hope that in future it will really help other researchers build on existing findings and be able to replicate and reproduce previous findings. And I think that's it from me. So happy to answer any questions now or at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosa. Thanks for your presentation. I think one of the biggest changes really needs to come from funders. So that's amazing. You are doing such an amount of job for this, right? Well, amount of work, sorry. We actually have a question on the Q&A. Have you had any challenges making your review panelists properly follow the DORA? I'm thinking that one, they may be resistant to its principles, and two, even if they do support them, lack of time might mean they still revert to looking at impact factors and publication records. I think it's a very good question.
Yes, and I think we're probably not the only ones. There are so many institutions and funders signing up to DORA, but we see that the value of impact factors and number of publications and the order of authors in publications is just so ingrained in research culture that the shift is slow. But I think we have to start somewhere, right? And the fact that we're talking about it all the time, I think it will slowly change those conversations at review level. In our board, there are so many panel members that really take it on board and really quote DORA principles when they're reviewing grants. Others not so much, but I think it's just bringing them along, and with time, hopefully it will, be part of not just how we review grants, but also how universities put promotions up or hire. And so it's kind of a systems change that needs to happen. I'm hopeful we'll get there at some point.
Yes, we have another question from Claire Russell. Have you looked at the diversity of your reviewers?
We have started collecting that data about a year ago. So we're at the point where we can start analyzing it. We've looked at diversity in terms of gender only, because that was something we could use a specialized software to do. And I believe we do have equal numbers of men and women reviewing for us. And in our board, we certainly now have more women than men in our board. But when it comes to other protected characteristics, we still don't have that data yet analyzed.
All right. Thanks so much, Rosa. That was amazing. We're going to move on to our last speaker. So next on the list is Sepideh Keshavarzi. I hope I pronounced that well. Who is a senior research fellow at the Sainsbury Wellcome Center. Whenever you want, Sepi.
Yes, I'm just going to share this first. Okay, there we go. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So first, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm actually learning a lot in this webinar because unlike some of the others on the panel, I am not a champion of implementing and promoting these, and I hope to be adding more and more of these practices in my current and future research. So currently I'm a senior research fellow at the Sainsbury Wellcome Center, and in a few months I will open my own lab in Cambridge. And my area is in systems neuroscience. We mainly work with mice and in area of spatial orientation, self-motion. So there's a lot of techniques that involve with the complex big data of electrophysiology, imaging, behavior, which through this talk, I will point out to some of the things that would be relevant to credibility issue with this sort of data and what we had tried to do and what I'm hoping to do further in the future. And also point out some of the challenges. So to begin with, actually, I want to highlight what the problem is, because we talk about this today, about the credibility problem in science, but what are the evidence? I mean, I think many of you may have seen this. This was a survey done by Nature back in 2016. And it was asking researchers across many different fields whether they have failed to reproduce an experiment. And surprisingly, more than 70%, as shown on the graph on the left, across different disciplines reported that they could not reproduce someone else's work, but also maybe even more surprisingly, more than 50% could not reproduce their own work. And when they were asked about what were the factors they thought, so this is a survey, they're all perceptions, that had caused this problem, a lot had reported things like selecting reporting, pressure to publish, and also issues related to design of studies like low statistical power and not having much details when disseminating research so that others can actually replicate them. And so over the past couple of years, there have been a lot of articles coming out just addressing what are the problems and how this can be mitigated. And just I'm putting some of them here. And so what I would want to point out here about, so how can we fix this, as others also mentioned this from different perspectives. I personally think the major issue would have to come from the top, from fixing the system, from funders' perspective, from hiring bodies, research and academic institutions that would basically decide on both hiring and promotion of academics. And also our publishing system really needs to change the way we are evaluating work. But of course, us as researchers and research teams have a big role here to play. And the least it can, in the long run, helps some of our work to be easier to access for ourselves. Like, as was mentioned before, if we are going to look back about what we did a couple of months ago, even sometimes it's hard to be able to even figure that out. So I'm going to focus on that part because this is where my knowledge is mostly. And I can just summarize it under a few categories. One is basically, obviously, the study design and the methodology. So from the beginning, what has been the consideration about, is this study having the adequate statistical power? In my own field, I can tell you this is sometimes really an issue because we are now gaining more and more data. We are able to record, for example, when one experiment from many more cells that we could ever have done. So this, especially when people go and report or are studying something at single cell level, then they may ignore that you may still need to have enough animal numbers to consider variability between animals. And so there are all these issues, and then you have to balance between how many, like reducing animal use to the minimum required and also having the statistical power. So these are important, and I'm glad to see that funders across different funding schemes are now requiring in our grant applications that we specify these. The other things is to have an analysis plan to avoid issues like p-hacking, basically getting a lot of data and then just looking in there to see what we find, instead of having specific questions that we can then, with a planned analysis, go and test those. And another aspect is just with the study design is the type of methods we use, both for data acquisition and analysis of data. There are now more and more open science tools that are developed, which is fantastic because it allows us now to standardize our methods. In our field, this has been really booming, and it is already changing the field, because it used to be that a few labs, which has a lot of resources, would have a few highly skilled people would just do their own coding, build their own acquisition software, etc. And basically no one else can even try to replicate those. But now we have these tools, and I will just mention a few of them in the next slides. And then the other parts with research dissemination is to have obviously a detailed methodology in our papers, which as much as we think we try, you see that there is still gaps that when we go and look at our own paper from a few years ago and want to someone new in the lab to just do that exactly from scratch, they may not be able to, because there are always some details that may be missed. And then obviously sharing data and analysis code, and I will mention a bit about that. And finally, publication methods. And it may not come very obvious why, for example, preprints may help with fixing the credibility issue. Open access, okay, sure, do you have data available to a larger pool of researchers, so it facilitates, but the same thing with preprints, because it also speed up the process of sharing and so replication process. Okay, so for example, things that we have, it has been very useful for us and for some of other colleagues here at our institute are open hardware and tools, for example, for electrophysiology and things like hardware like OpenEFIS. If any of you are in systems neuroscience, you may be aware of it, or just development of miniscopes, small microscopes that allow to image from many cells in deeper structure in the rodents, and these are now like open source tools available to do these things. And on top of that, there are also softwares that has allowed us to do our research better. For example, for tracking animals, there's software such as DeepLabCut, or for those who do extracellular recording, and they will end up usually with large variation between users about how they sort their spike that they record. And now there are platforms that unify different softwares and allow us to compare between them, and so we can see whether their finding of our research is robust and is, or whether it is really dependent on what software you've used to sort out the spikes in your electrophysiology record. Other things, softwares for example, people are now using for calcium imaging, and also another suite that was developed in here at Sainsbury Wellcome Center, and part of this package in our own lab, which is for neuroanatomical analysis. And for example, the advantage of this tool was it allowed us to count cells in a whole brain image data sets, which are huge, in an automated way, instead of having individuals in old days that go and sit and click and one by one on cells. And first, now with big data, this is even impossible, more or less. And a second, it is very much error prone. So all of these methods that I'm just putting out there, it means that we can have standardized methods of acquiring data and then analyzing data. And some of these, a lot of them actually are available in this link that I've put there, that is compiling many different tools that are now out there for open neuroscience research. So if you're interested, have a look at this website. Then when it comes to dissemination, well, obviously we want to have a detailed methodology, and this can be time-consuming. This is just an example I've put out from my latest paper here, and this is just a table of some of the resources like reagents, and there's actually another table following this. A lot of softwares and algorithms that sometimes we may ignore, that to actually cite these, to make detailed record of it in our methodology, so someone else can replicate that. And on the right, I'm putting just an example example of a table that just puts shows a parameter, like if we just put it in a supplementary of our paper, that someone can use the same parameters with this spike sorting, for example, software, and with the shared data, hopefully, and to get same outcome, or at least know what we use. So sometimes these are not even requested from either reviewers or from the editors. And so maybe we need to move forward with also making these things more standard. So yes, so one of the questions, for example, for me to improve is how to make sure that really our complex experimental setups can be replicated in another lab. So this means sharing our design of the setups, the diagrams of all the wiring, etc. So these are all, again, as was mentioned before, time consuming, and it needs thinking from beginning and planning. The other thing is to share codes, and we are now doing it more and more regularly, both in our lab and in other places in the institute. And the most important thing here is to then have a very detailed and clear documentation. I'm just putting an example of a code which was in that paper, which has been documented here also by my colleague Adam. And this just shows an example of extra effort you have to put into making these things available. And again, proper code documentation is time consuming. As an example, I have another code shared in that paper that I'm still working on the documentation of that. So finally, it's about sharing data. And this is probably for very big and complex data sets like what I work with is maybe the most challenging part, because the compiling of this data need, again, planning from beforehand. A lot of more senior labs that have been there and operating for years may not have had this in place from beginning. So these things need to change. When you open your own lab, you have to think about all this in advance. This also brings questions of when do you want to share your data? Do you still want to do something with it and you're worried that you'll be scooped or not? Usually, I think it's the case that when something is published, people feel they can share the data. There is not that common to think that there are going to be specific questions that they are following up that can be immediately scooped by having the data available. It's also about what to share. For example, again, when in my work, where it would create over a few years, hundreds of terabytes of data, just sharing the raw data may be impossible, more or less. So it's all comes to these questions of possibilities, what sort of process data you will share, and also how to share it. And then here is what a few examples of many that I'm just listing under that. The first, for example, neuromorph and gene are specific to neuroscience, and the others that are derived fiction and Zenodo is across all sort of fields and platforms. And there are also this NIH Brain Initiative have some recommendations for repositories for different types of data that you can have a look. And then finally, publication method, as I said, both publishing open access and publishing in preprints, in my opinion at least, do help with the replication of studies, and credibility speeds it up and also makes it more available to a wider pool of researchers. But so obviously we talked about that. It not only makes it available to a larger number, but also to people maybe outside of just your immediate research field, for even policymakers, maybe practitioners that would find your finding interesting. And now there's more and more requirement from funders to also publish in open access. But again, some of the challenges is that if you want to still publish in hybrid journals, which are still, we can discuss why and how that can change, but a lot of them are still the ones that can land you a job, then you will have to pay a lot for open access. Now, I'm in an institute which is very well funded. We just routinely publish open access because we can afford it. And now there's a question of, do all funders provide money for this? Not really. And what are the alternative options and so on. And then there are preprints. It's just a few repository I'm listing here, and there are more. And the questions that come with them is, so what is the quality control for this many work which is out there? How can I just go and assess whether this work was really solid enough to think about it as something to follow on, or how it fits with my work? And so there are actually some initiatives out there. One is this peer community in neuroscience that I recommend you to have a look. There's a community of neuroscientists, they are all peers who go and can review the preprints before, and it's a parallel. It doesn't mean that if you decide that your preprint will be reviewed by this community, then you can't send it to a journal. This can be done in parallel. And it will be free, it will be high quality, the review will be open. And then one of the peers in this community will act like the editor, and then by reading their reviews will decide that, okay, this is a preprint that can be recommended as a validated and a high quality work. Then the other issue that I have with preprints is that I think we need to move maybe to a point where it becomes really standard to cite them, because some people still have reservation that they will be scooped, or sometimes you put a preprint out, a work that comes out a couple of months down the line while your paper is already also under review elsewhere, does not cite it, even if it's directly and completely relevant to their work. So these are questions of why is this the case and how that can change. And finally, I just very briefly want to mention that there are also things you need to think in advance. So for me, I want to open my lab. These are things to consider: data management. How do we structure the data in the lab? The raw data, process data, the analysis workflow, they all have to be in structures that is very easily searchable, available, electronic lab books, and having some data workflow. And the examples that I'm putting here, both for having a data workflow and also standardizing data for sharing, not just with your collaborators, but with the wider community in the world, are now examples that I showed. These are also another efforts that have been done and very, very successful in the field, Data Joint and this Neurodata Without Borders. So finally, I just want to point out a few challenges that just came up already, both before and also what I was mentioning. I think it's the competition, both for jobs and for resources, and the publication pressure. And also the time pressure that not only may compromise unintentionally the quality of research, but also the time that we can put for evaluating other works, like for peer review. And not having thorough peer review will lead to some of the problems that we are facing today. And again, training is required for this culture shift, and we need to think of funding sources to support it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Seppi, for such a great talk. We've got some questions in the Q&A. The first one is, how common is it both within your own group and amongst your colleagues at Sainsbury's and beyond to pre-register studies? Do you think it will or should become standard?
So this is, I put it there, but I didn't talk about it at all, because I think it's still a new concept for many of us, and we're a bit unsure how it works in our field. So I don't know anyone who has pre-registered here. And I know there are still dividing groups about this, of whether this will put some change into science or not. How would it be in practice? How would it really help the credibility in practice? So we are not the, as far as I know, we are not the pioneers to test it yet. And I would really love to see if anyone else is going that way in our field, how it goes.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, thank you. We have another question that is more general for the speakers. What one thing would each of the panelists do or like to see happen to drive credibility in neuroscience? What one thing would they suggest researchers do to drive the credibility of their own research? So maybe Seppi, can you start?
Yes, I think okay, so maybe I'm generally a bit of a cynic. So I always think about the system, and I would say we need to have, at the system level, we really need a kind of a revolution in our field, because as long as we keep going with the way the evaluation is, I mean, I was in the job market and I put my preprint out there and everyone said that, oh, this is going to be considered now, etc. And with the same exactly same data, I mean, not much was changed in that 9 months period until it got really published in a journal. My chances of getting interview went from really low to really high. So there are still things that have not been established. And I think these need to change the way we are evaluating scientists and promoting them. And in terms of individual scientists, I think maybe because it's something I'm less, like I have not implemented as much as I would like to, is to have this data workflows from beginning. So you have a structure that you can easily then years down the line go and look at the data right away, and with a few codes we're able to run the same analysis without thinking of where things are. So that's all I can say, I guess.
Thank you. How about our two other panelists? Emily, what's your point of view?
I guess just answering the second bit, I was just so overwhelmed by Rosa's talk in terms of all the things that Alzheimer's Research UK are doing. And one thing that we're trying to do at Surrey is to sort of tackle the barrier that people see in terms of both time and funding, to get people to think about any costs that they could put into their grant applications, which will better enable them to do open research. So we just saw from Sepideh all of the work that was required to kind of make things openly available. Now, many funders, including the main ones like UKRI, and I'm sure Alzheimer's Research UK would accommodate this as well. But if you think about how much time you will need of somebody's time to make all your data available, to make your code available, to properly document stuff and get it funded within your grant, then that relieves that barrier. So that's something that I think people need to start thinking about. And I think funders are receptive to that change, that people are going to be starting to add that in. In fact, UKRI have got a tool now that you can work through. I'll see if I can find it while we're on the chat and put it on the chat, sorry. So yeah, that would be my one tip, I think, to start to kind of move that culture shift.
Thank you, Rosa. Emily. Rosa, what's one thing you would like to see driving a boost on credibility in neuroscience?
So I think the previous two answers were really good. So I'll just add a different thing, which is publication of negative results, which I think is really important, and people just don't have the motivation or time to dedicate to that. I think as a funder, providing a platform that accommodates negative results like the F1001, or implementing that registered report process alongside our review will hopefully increase the number of negative results we see being published. But then if I can add a different thing to that, that's just a funder's perspective. When it comes to what a researcher can do to improve credibility in research, I think it's really important that each researcher really takes a lot of these issues as the ethos of their work and their group. So things like how they design their studies, how they record their experiments, how they manage and analyze their data, how they randomize, all of those things. Researchers need training on all of those items and then pass it on to their PhD students and their masters, because they're the ones who are being trained now to be good researchers in the future, and they need to have training in those very basic research skills that will improve credibility in future.
Yes, okay. Thanks so much for all these insights. It's been a great debate. I don't think we have more time left. So just 2 things before we all leave. Remember, you can check out other webinars and credibility work at the BNA website. And as a last note, the nominations for the 2023 credibility prizes will open next week. And we have 3 categories: student researcher, individual researcher, and team. So please, if you have someone in mind, you can nominate them from next week onwards. Thank you so much to the speakers for sharing their insights with all of us. It's been a pleasure, really. And thanks a lot to all the attendees for being here and for the questions. So hopefully see you on the next one.